Martha.
Thank you so much, Brett. Tonight, the story begins in Hawaii, where indeed the president did just land moments ago. Welcome to the story. I'm Martha MacCallum, live tonight from Pearl Harbor, where the president will visit the USS Arizona. The Arizona is directly behind us here. It will be a moving reminder of the loss of life here on December the 7th, 1941. And right in front of us is the USS Missouri, where the Japanese signed the document of surrender in Tokyo Bay. They are literally bookends of the United States involvement in World War II. The president will head directly this evening to a briefing at the Pacific Command, led by Admiral Harris. The Pacific Command is our front line. It is the command that would seek to defend the United States against threats from North Korea or China, both of which have the capability to reach our bases in South Korea, in Japan, in Guam, in Hawaii, and even the west coast of the United States. So as the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, put it, these threats are real, and we are running out of time to thwart them.
President Trump will reiterate the plain fact that North Korea threatens not just our allies South Korea and Japan and the United States. North Korea is a threat to the entire world, so all nations of the world must do more to counter that threat.
Kim Jong-un's regime releasing this statement in response today, saying, quote, "The reality clearly shows that the gangster-like U.S. imperialists are the very ones who are aggravating the situation of the Korean Peninsula and seeking to ignite a nuclear war." So that is the situation that the president walks into as he begins this very historic trip. This is the itinerary. Monday, he will be in Japan. He will meet with Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko. Also, bilateral meetings with Prime Minister Abe. As you just heard, Brett Baer will sit down with Prime Minister Abe during that trip as well. So Tuesday, the president moves to South Korea, where he will meet with President Moon. President Trump will also speak at the National Assembly, where he will celebrate the enduring alliance and friendship between the two countries, and he will call on the international community to join together in maximizing pressure on North Korea. Right now, there are no plans for the president to visit the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, which has caused a bit of controversy. We will watch to see if there's any change in that part of the agenda. And on Wednesday, the most important stop of all, perhaps, is in Beijing. He will meet there with President Xi. Also, a series of trade and cultural events. He has CEOs on this trip as well. The economy is a big part of this agenda as well. So the most important, though, clearly, the insistence that China crack down on North Korea and their nuclear weapons program. Then you've got Friday in Vietnam. The president will participate in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the APEC summit. Russian President Vladimir Putin will also be there. No word yet on whether the president and Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, will be meeting one-on-one, but they will definitely be obviously in the same arena as they attend that. So then you've got Sunday, Manila, Philippines. Also a controversial part of the trip, the president will meet the Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte. For the first time, he has been basically criticized for taking too harsh an offense against drug offenders in his country and for violating human rights. They will sit down there. November 13th is part of that visit. The president will attend the second summit of the trip at the U.S.-ASEAN summit. And as just announced today, he will spend an extra day extending his trip. In total, it's a long trip. The president tweeted this just moments ago, right before landing. He said, "Getting ready to land in Hawaii. Looking so much forward to meeting with our great military veterans at Pearl Harbor." And I am joined now by Mark Thiessen, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush and a Fox News contributor. Retired Brigadier General Anthony Tata has more than 3 decades of public service as a military officer. And Jessica Tarlov, Senior Director of Research at Bustle.com and a Fox News contributor as well. Welcome to all of you. Great to have you here. As we mentioned, the president has landed. It's good to have you with us. The first stop is going to be at PACOM, which is the Pacific Command. There's such a strong military presence here in this part of Hawaii, and no doubt that is going to be the focus. You can see the shot of the plane now, and as he comes in, we will continue to take you to all of this live. Mark, let me start with you. Your thoughts about the trip as we begin tonight.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is the longest presidential trip to the Asia-Pacific region since 1991, when George H.W. Bush vomited on the Japanese prime minister. So there's a low bar for success here, just as long as he doesn't hurl.
Just don't
but look,
throw
I mean,
up.
the president has done. But look, the president's best moments in the 9 months that he's been in office have come when he's been abroad. His trip to Saudi Arabia and to Israel was a huge success. He gave a great speech in Saudi Arabia. His trip to Poland, he gave another fantastic speech, and to NATO. So I expect that this is going to be a very successful trip because he's on his best behavior and most presidential when he's on these trips. I expect he's going to give some very well thought out, substantive, solid speeches about important matters, and he's going to embrace the trappings of the presidency, which he doesn't tend to do. So I expect not a lot of tweeting, a lot of important speech making, and a lot of policy getting made.
General Tata, your thoughts on this PACOM briefing? What do you expect he will hear in there?
Well, you know, Martha, what I think is really stunning about this trip is that he's got the opportunity to go straight to the foxhole, and he's going to Pacific Command, U.S. Army Pacific. He'll get all those briefings today, then he'll go to Japan, then he'll go to Republic of Korea, and he'll be able to see actually what it's like on the ground there. And it's very important that we reach a diplomatic solution here, and I think that will be reinforced based upon what the leaders in Hawaii and Republic of Korea and Japan talked to him about. And then he goes, as you said, to Beijing, where the continuation of diplomatic solution discussions will take place. So I really see this as a two-part deal. One is to get marshal the international community to put pressure on, continue the pressure on North Korea to find a diplomatic solution so that we do not have nuclear warfare. And two is to get China to, and it's a real tough tightrope to walk, because we want better economic conditions with China, better market access and better exchange rates and so forth. But we also need their help on North Korea. So that's a tightrope that he's going to have to walk as we reassure all the allies that we're with them.
We need their help on North Korea, to be sure. It's also a time when they're expanding in the South China Seas and trying to expand their own military footprint. So it's a very delicate dance as he heads to Beijing midway through this process. Jessica, your thoughts as he has now landed and begins this big trip?
Yeah, well, I actually agree with everything that's been said on the panel so far, except for the point that Mark made about the speeches being his best. There are obviously some policy points that he's conveyed that I don't agree with, just from my own political sensibilities. But I certainly agree that the president in the last 9 months has done the best when he is abroad, and I hope that that continues. I am concerned about the tweeting and him carrying on about the DOJ investigation and Jeff Sessions and everything that's going on at home. I think a few tweets about tax reform would be useful, because obviously on the Hill there's a big push to get that done for Republicans. But I hope that he really focuses on what's in front of him, listens to everyone there, and makes sure that when he's with our allies that he reassures them that we are going to be with them in every capacity that we can, and that he is tough with China, and makes it clear to them that we want to be great economic partners, we want a fair deal on everything, but that they have to do more with North Korea, and that we will economically sanction them if they're not more helpful.
Yeah. I mean, Mark, obviously, in terms of the first stop here today, to visit with the members of PACOM, Admiral Harris will be leading that trip and that visit. The president does have a good record of very strong relationships with the military and wanting the military to be strong, wanting them to lead the way with, have surrounded himself with some very important and influential generals in his cabinet. Speak to me about what you think that communication will be like when he's there today.
Yeah, well, I hope he's going to sit down and be presented with some serious war plans for the Korean Peninsula, and some serious options other than sitting around and just saying we're going to destroy you, because he needs to have real quality military options. The reality is we're not going to have a diplomatic solution if North Korea and China and everybody in the region thinks that military solution is off the table. The only way we're going to convince them to do this peacefully is if they really believe, and the president's been trying to do this, that he's willing to, unlike all of his predecessors, Republicans and Democrats, for the last quarter century, he's actually willing to use the military option to stop North Korea from getting this weapon. Because we're in a situation right now where for 25 years, Republicans and Democrats have been kicking this problem down the road, and we're out of road. On his watch, North Korea is either going to become a country that can strike the United States with a ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon, or it's not. And he's there. You're right there where the last time an unchecked Asian power was able to strike the American homeland. His job, I hope that focuses him. I think there's symbolism in that he wants to send a message. We're not going to let this ever happen to our country again, and North Korea is not going to be allowed to develop the capability to hit the United States with a nuclear missile.
Yeah, you touched on such an important point, and that's something that we have been witnessing so clearly in the past 48 hours here, General Tato. When you visit the USS Arizona, and you are literally suspended above the Arizona and the 1,177 lives that it took with it. And you think about the Japanese plane swooping in to the waters here at 30 feet above the water, and the shock and the surprise of that attack. And all of World War II, the tremendous loss of life. There's no way that you can go through that memorial and not feel the weight as a president, I would imagine, of what is on your shoulders when you talk about military options.
Yeah, as you did, Martha, you will look down at that water and you will see the oil still leaking out of the Arizona, and it is just such a symbolic reminder of the blood and treasure lost during World War II. And I agree with everything we're talking about here, and that the military option is on the table, and it is seriously on the table. And when you really think about it, would we rather fight them today when we're not sure about their capability? We're pretty sure that they can't range too much of the United States. They may be able to range some of it. Or do we want to fight them in 5 years when we're sure that they can range all the way into the middle, maybe even the East Coast of the United States? I'd much rather fight them now, and I think that's the president's position here. And I'd much rather, as I said earlier, have a diplomatic solution. But if this comes to war, and I think this nation is ready for that, then let's fight them now.
But let me ask you, what do you mean when you say let's fight them now? I know Mark has mentioned the option of having a no-fly zone over South Korea and having a policy where any missile that is set off will be shot down. Is that something that you think we should adopt as a policy, General?
Well, I think really what you're talking about, Martha, is you got two real issues here. You've got the conventional threat of 8,000 artillery tubes on the DMZ from North Korea and about 4,000 rocket launchers. So they conventionally checkmate us, and that's what they've done for the last 20 years. So you've got to have a way to get at those 12,000 items of weapons that can range Seoul. And at the same time, you've got to decapitate that government in Pyongyang. And Kim Jong-un right now is Airbnb-ing it all over North Korea because of the information warfare that's going on. So as we, and which is a good thing, because the more he moves around, the more he'll communicate and the more mistakes that they'll make. And so a lot of this tweeting and so forth is information warfare. And you and I have talked before, Martha, about diplomatic, information, military, and economic elements of national power. We're tightening the screws in every respect. And I guarantee you, my good friend General Bob Brown over there, the Pacific U.S. Army Pacific Commander, he's got a good plan for the Army. Vince Brooks, General Vince Brooks in the Republic of Korea, they've got a good plan right now, and I bet you it's a combination of conventional and nuclear options.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I agree with everything that's been said, and I think that a policy of muscular militarism is the way to go here. If North Korea doesn't feel like we'll actually back anything up, then it's totally useless. But it would be helpful, I think, if the president would make sure not to hurt any sort of diplomatic chance that we have to make progress there, like with the tweet about Rex Tillerson about a month ago saying, oh, give it a rest, it's not going to work. I mean, we are understaffed at the State Department at this point. I mean, in all departments, quite frankly. And I think it's important for him to also bolster the roles of our diplomats while he's over there, and to make that clear to our allies that we're working on all cylinders to make sure the military option is our last option. I don't want to sound too dovish, but I just had to throw that in there.
It seems that this president believes that the most powerful form of diplomacy is making
Twitter
sure
diplomacy?
that the enemy is making sure that the that the opposition, in this case, believes that you would take military action. And there you have President Donald Trump and the First Lady, Melania Trump, just arriving as they get off Air Force One here in Honolulu to begin what Mark pointed out is going to be the longest presidential trip of this kind that we have seen in a very long time. They will be here this evening. They will visit the USS Arizona overnight tonight. And obviously, as we mentioned, they're going to have the PACOM briefing. He will this afternoon. But this is a very significant way, as we have mentioned, to begin this trip, to begin it in Hawaii, which looks out over this very potentially dangerous part of the world, and a part that he will visit where he'll try to shore up relations with our allies, with Japan, with South Korea. He will visit Vietnam. He will visit the Philippines as well. And there you see the traditional receiving of the leis as they arrive in Hawaii, and a hug for Melania Trump as she has begun this part of the trip too, standing by the president's side throughout the course of this. Let me go back to you, Mark, as we watch all of this. You have been part of these trips in the Bush White House. You know, what goes through your mind as you watch this president, still fairly new at the job, not a year in, begin this very historic journey?
I just think the stakes are so high. I've been on that plane landing on that airport with President Bush traveling to that part of the world, and with Secretary Rumsfeld. But the stakes have never been higher for an American president traveling to Asia, because, as I indicated earlier, we've run out of road to kick the can down on North Korea, and this is our one chance to rally the world towards some sort of a solution that short of the total war that the general laid out. So the stakes on this trip are incredibly high, and I hope that Admiral Harris and some of the commanders at PACOM there are going to be giving him a set of military options short of total war. For example, you alluded to, I had suggested that the president could declare a no-fly zone over the Korean Peninsula. No ballistic missiles will be allowed to launch from the Korean Peninsula. We will take them down either with ballistic missile defenses, or we'll take them out on the launch pad. And just as declaratory policy and reassurance to the Korean regime that if they don't retaliate, we're not going to go for regime change right away. And so therefore they have to make a choice. Do they want the regime to be destroyed by retaliating or not? This would be something similar to what the Israelis did with the nuclear program in Syria, where they took out the North Korean-built nuclear plant in Syria, and the Syrians did nothing in response. So I think we need to try a lot of options to make sure that that include military to stop this thing in its tracks before we get to. And that would also send the seriousness that if they do keep going, we will take them out, as the general laid out.
Yeah, great point. Jessica, one of the tricky things, obviously, about dealing with China is the president's long-held feelings about the unfair trade practices that he believes that they participate in. So he wants to press them on that. He wants to press them on the issue of their aggressiveness in expansion in the South China Seas, building islands in order to expand their military base in that area. At the same time, he would like to improve trade relations. He decided not to do the TPP, which will be met with some criticism in some of the countries that he's visiting, and he wants to do a lot of bilateral trade agreements where it's just one-on-one, and that's why you see a whole series of these kinds of meetings set up here with regard to trade. Your thoughts on all that?
My thoughts are, I thought it was very illuminating in an interview earlier this week, or maybe last week, that he said that President Xi was like King Xi of China, that he's very clear about how much power he wields and in the region generally. And I think he really sees it as a meeting of two kings, as it were, the Western world and the Eastern world there. I hope that he goes in with very clear policies that he wants enacted, especially in terms of trade, since he's going to be going after bilateral agreements there, and that he's just as direct as possible. It would be great for there to be some hard resolutions that come out of this instead of kind of waffle talk around these issues. And it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what President Xi is willing to compromise on and how he views all of this. There have been a lot of talks in the foreign policy community right now about how this is essentially President Xi's world at this point, and that he's amassing more and more power, as you said, expanding into the South and East China Sea, taking over land that Japan sees as their own, and obviously Japan, one of our closest allies. So it'll be interesting to see, for me, really, if there are any resolutions that come out of this, and what are the policies that President Trump actually advocates for when he's sitting, face to face with President Xi.
Yeah, and you can't really underestimate the importance of sitting face-to-face with these leaders. And as you just pointed out, the leaders in South Korea and also in Japan, Prime Minister Abe, are going to be looking for that reassurance because they do not
100%.
want China, obviously, to dominate the seas around that area. So they're going to be looking for some reassurance from the president. General Tata, there has been some discussion over the past 24, 36 hours about the possibility that North Korea could test a missile during this trip. What do you think about the possibility of that?
Well, I think it's highly possible. You know, it depends on where they shoot it, where it lands, and ultimately how provocative they want to be. But it would be a hugely stupid thing for Kim Jong-un to do, and it would be a finger in the president's eye. And I was getting ready to mention that my biggest concern about these parallel converging railroad tracks that us and North Korea are on is a mistake that could be made, and that would be a mistake that could be made that could ultimately lead to a more emotional rather than rational response, or either way, we need to be able to look at that, and I am sure that is one of the contingencies that has been laid out. If they shoot, what is our flexible response option? We have, as was being laid out earlier, we have flexible deterrent options, flexible response options. We could move Rangers onto the Korean Peninsula. We could fly more B-1 bombers. We've got 3 carrier strike groups in the sea right there off the Korean Peninsula. It is right now we are prepped militarily to attack North Korea, and if they were to launch while the president is boots on the ground in South Korea, that would be a huge mistake that could spark the forest fire, so to speak, that starts this thing. And I really think that we need to be. I'm sure that they've thought through this. The planners have, H.R. McMaster, and so forth.
It's a great point. It's a great point. Spending some time in the Pearl Harbor Museum yesterday, and you look at the images there and the efforts that were made at diplomacy right before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, up to the final hours before they attacked Pearl Harbor, and you had sort of 2 streams that weren't talking to each other in Japan, and the military attack was already underway while those diplomatic efforts were being sought. And it just gives you, Mark, that sense of the reality of what happens in an emotional moment. Not that that was a particularly emotional moment, it was clearly planned, but how easy it is when you look across the course of history to slip into war when there are mixed messages or diplomacy fails.
And it's a reminder. I mean, the general was talking about miscalculations. I mean, the dictators are prone to miscalculate. One of the problems that we have is that we can't count on Kim Jong-un to behave as a rational actor. I mean, he's acting rationally for his interests, but there's no debate within the North Korean regime about strategy. If you walk into Kim Jong-un's office and say, "Dear leader, I think you're making a big mistake testing this missile while Donald Trump is in the Korean Peninsula," you're going to find yourself on the receiving end of an artillery barrage. People are terrified. So people don't go up to the leader and say, "You're making a mistake, you ought to really reconsider," because they're afraid that they're going to get purged. This is one of the reasons why we had a war in Iraq, was that Saddam Hussein, if he had no weapons of mass destruction stockpiles, all he had to do was let the inspectors come in and say, "Here, you got free reign, there's nothing here, you can look anywhere you want," and there would have been no war. So we can't count on these dictators to make rational decisions, rational in terms of how we see the world. And then you've got the added problem of, these are North Korean missiles. What if they test a missile and instead of going over Tokyo, it lands in Tokyo? Accidentally. You could have an entire war start just because the other side miscalculated. So these are serious contingencies that the military has to prepare the president for.
I actually had the honor of... Sorry, I just wanted to say quickly, I went to Japan for the first time over the summer and went to Hiroshima. So now seeing, the other side of what can happen when something like this breaks out, and the devastation, seeing it, face to face and going through that memorial, which I would recommend everybody does. And obviously hearing the responses to President Obama's visit, which was legendary at this point and something so wonderful for the country and for our relationship with Japan. You hope that we certainly stay away from any of that, but you also have a greater understanding for the fear in which they live of what's going on in North Korea, and that something like Mark just said could happen just even by accident.
Yeah, and I would recommend that we bring a delegation from Pyongyang into Hiroshima and Nagasaki and show them what can happen.
That's a great idea.
If they'd be willing, I think it would be smart. Yeah.
And China as well, because China's going to get, if we end up in major warfare on the Korean Peninsula, China is going to be the bill payer in a big way.
Yeah.
And refugees, and more importantly to China really, is what is the end state of the Korean Peninsula? Because do they want the West flush up on their border? And I think the answer is no.
Right.
And so that the North Korea has always been that buffer spring for them, and so they've got a really tough calculation to make here. How far do they go? How far do they let this brinksmanship go? Meanwhile, sort of something that we haven't talked about yet is in the South China Sea, China is building islands in one of the most heavily trafficked commercial shipping lanes in the world, and we've got so the delicate balance that President Trump has right now is how do you get China to back off and reassure Vietnam and the Philippines that those shipping lanes are going to stay open, and how do we keep those open, and then how do we get into their markets? How do we get the right exchange rates with China, and then how do we get them to help us with North Korea? It is a very complex set of negotiations going on right now.
It absolutely is, for all of the reasons that you just mentioned. You've got the economic pressures, you've got the military pressures, you've got China's real aggression to really want to be the world dominant force, and for the United States to sort of lose that ground. And so that becomes your negotiating partner with trying to get North Korea to back off on these exercises that have the whole world very much on edge. And you think about the fact, as Mark pointed out, that for the past 25 years we have kicked the can down the road with North Korea. So this president is not going into this trip as as an act of tourism. I mean, this is a very heavy weighted situation that he walks into. There has been a lot of tweet diplomacy, as Jessica pointed out, but this is face-to-face diplomacy. And I think it's also worth pointing out that he will have, in some parts of these interactions, American CEOs along on this trip as well, to sort of discuss the economic realities and the trade deals that they want. But this is you talk about the art of the deal. And this is very high stakes negotiation, as we pointed out. I just want to mention that, obviously the president enjoys the moment that he's in right now. He loves meeting people on the tarmac, as he's doing. These are mostly military families that are there. You saw a lot of members of the Navy along the way. He tends to take more time sometimes than his people might like in these moments, but he doesn't particularly care. He really likes to spend the time shaking hands and taking some pictures with everyone along the course of this route, and they are enormously enthusiastic to see him in Honolulu today, which is it's just an absolutely spectacularly beautiful place, and he and the First Lady are clearly sort of soaking up this moment as they continue through it. In terms of, I see some waves now. It looks like they might be starting to move, and they'll head, as we said, to this briefing with PACOM. And just to give you a sense of what the rest of the evening looks like, there's a little bit of downtime worked into the schedule after the briefing at PACOM. Then he will move behind us to the USS Arizona, and he will lay a wreath there. Every president since Kennedy, which is when it was built, the memorial was finished in 1962 and opened, and President Kennedy visited just months before his assassination. But it is a very moving spot and a sort of presidential memorial ritual of sorts as we watch the president and the First Lady make their way towards their vehicle here. Jessica, obviously the First Lady gets a lot of attention as well when she travels with him on these trips. She'll be, taking part in some of these meetings. She is standing by his side for the duration of this long trip together. She's with her husband. Your thoughts?
No, I think that that's great. I mean, I think that united first family is always a wonderful thing, and even presidents I've disagreed with politically had great first families like George W. Bush, and I think that Melania makes President Trump better. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. I like seeing them together like that. And, I wanted to add, and you mentioned this in the initial introduction to the segment, but we haven't talked about the importance of President Trump emphasizing human rights on this trip. That's something obviously to be done in the Philippines, but as well with China. And I know that human rights advocates back here and certainly in the Western world will be watching to see what kind of push he gives there for the importance of, democracy and human rights. And Melania looks great.
Jessica, thank you.
As always, right? Yeah, always. She's so good looking. Yeah.
I know. She's a beautiful First Lady.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to watch this. They split off. She's going in one direction, and he is heading over to the briefing as expected. As we watch this, enormous moment as all of this begins. Mark Thiessen, General Tata, thank you very much. Jessica Tarlov, thank you all.
Thanks, Martha.
For being here and taking us through this part of the beginning of this trip. It's great to have you with us, all of you. Thank you. So President Trump, as I mentioned, is now on his way to the Pacific Command for the briefing on North Korea and really on the entire area that falls under their command, which is enormous. It actually covers about 50% of the globe. So we will bring that to you. We expect a spray, as we call it. So you'll see some activity there, and we'll take you there as soon as that happens live on the story tonight. But first, remember this?
He served the United States with honor and distinction.
Bo Bergdahl admits to deserting his comrades and his country, but a judge has decided that that is not enough to put him behind bars. My next two guests are outraged at that decision. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer worked on the congressional record of his massive recovery effort, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz led search missions for Bo Bergdahl in Afghanistan. You will want to hear their reaction to this enormous story today. Trump landed a little while ago in Honolulu and is now at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. He was greeted by a number of local officials before heading over to the Pacific Command, where he will be briefed on the North Korea threats and on everything that is going on in the Pacific region. But first tonight, Bo Bergdahl walked into a North Carolina courtroom facing life in prison and walked out a free man today. You can see the pictures on the left and right. Obviously, he's back in civilian garb as he left those proceedings today, which was a big shock to a lot of people. A military judge ruling no time in jail after pleading guilty. He pled guilty to desertion. President Trump tweeted his outrage about this as well, saying, quote, "The decision on Sergeant Bergdahl is a complete and total disgrace for our country and our military." Jonathan Hunt, live in our West Coast newsroom with the backstory on that tonight. Jonathan.
Martha, 8 years after walking off his base in Afghanistan and into the hands of the Taliban, former sergeant, now demoted to private, Bo Bergdahl walked out of court a free man, bringing an end to a case that sparked strong emotions on both sides. In June 2009, Bergdahl walked away from his base in what he has since said was meant to be a protest about what he saw as leadership problems on that base. But he was quickly caught by the Taliban and held for 5 years, during which he says he was kept in a small metal cage and repeatedly beaten and tortured. Fellow soldiers were sent on missions to search for Bergdahl, and as the court heard, several of them were seriously wounded during those searches. When he was finally freed in exchange for 5 Taliban prisoners, President Obama welcomed Bergdahl's parents to the White House, and National Security Advisor Susan Rice said Bergdahl had served with, quote, honor and distinction. Others felt he was a traitor deserving of the harshest punishment. Then presidential candidate Donald Trump was among that group.
We're tired of Sergeant Bergdahl, who's a traitor. He's a traitor, a no-good traitor, who should have been executed.
Bergdahl's attorneys argued comments like that had tainted the case.
President Trump's unprincipled effort to stoke a lynch mob atmosphere while seeking our nation's highest office has cast a dark cloud over the case. Every American should be offended by his assault on the fair administration of justice and his disdain for basic constitutional rights.
Now, the military judge in this case did not explain how he arrived at his decision not to order any prison time, but he had previously called President Trump's comments disturbing. And Martha Bergdahl's attorney says his client has been through a terrible ordeal and he's, quote, glad it's over. Martha?
Jonathan Hunt, thank you so much. Here now with more, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, a CIA-trained intel operative who was involved in the classified military talks on the Bergdahl recovery mission, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz, a former Green Beret commander who led search missions with his men for Bergdahl. He is also a Fox News contributor. Gentlemen, welcome. Obviously, you are two of the best people to talk to on this night, and I know that you're very disappointed with the outcome here. Colonel Waltz, let me start with you on this. Tell everyone your reaction and also what you and your men did to find him.
Hey, Martha, you know, as a soldier, as a veteran, today I'm devastated. I'm devastated for my men who were actively baited into ambushes, searching for Bergdahl. The Taliban were feeding us false information and baiting us into places that we shouldn't have gone and missions that weren't properly vetted. I'm devastated for the SEAL who underwent 18 surgeries. I'm devastated for the Army sergeant who was shot in the head on a mission looking for Bergdahl and cannot speak and cannot walk anymore. So he's not walking free. None of these people, they all received a life sentence. And for Bergdahl to receive nothing, I find just an absolute travesty. I expected a reduction possibly in his sentence for how he was treated under the Taliban, which he brought under himself. But now to find out that not only is he walking free, he's appealing his dishonorable discharge and seeking what? An honorable discharge, and I would expect maybe a book deal and a movie deal after that. I just find absolutely devastating. And finally, Martha, you know, he is affecting these wheels that he set in motion and this trade that Obama approved is affecting American hostages all over the world as we speak, because all of those terrorist groups holding Americans hostage today expect to trade like what Bergdahl got. So it's just devastating all around.
Amazing. It's just shocking when you look at it and you hear your story, Michael Waltz, Colonel Waltz. And Tony, you were also involved in the activity surrounding this recovery mission as well. Your thoughts on how this ended?
Well, look, as Michael pointed out, there was an extraordinary effort made once he abandoned his post to get in there. I was involved in a number of aspects of this relating to just getting him back in some form. And a lot of us felt in many ways he should probably just perish on the battlefield where he went because he put himself there. As Michael said, look, this is setting all sorts of bad precedents, and most particularly, you know, this allows for essentially the idea that a soldier who gets fed up and tired can get up and leave his post and walk away and expect a sentence less than someone who sells drugs out of the barracks. Martha, I know people who went to Leavenworth for selling drugs out of the barracks who have longer sentences than this man who deserted his post. And to Michael's point, the Article 99 charge was partially based on the fact that there was some level of cooperation with Bergdahl after he went to the Taliban, who they allowed for him to help the Taliban set up ambushes of Waltz's folks. That's how bad this is.
Colonel Waltz, talk to us about the military proceeding, and the way that this was arrived at, and the judge who made this decision.
Well, I think, obviously the defense made their case for how he was treated, which I will point out is according to Bergdahl himself. I don't know that we have independent corroboration of how he was treated by the Taliban. And there is a whole body of thinking that he collaborated, with the Taliban.
Precisely.
So, I think they made their case. They essentially, his defense attorneys blamed the Army, that he should have never been led in the Army in the first place. But, to Tony's point, an apology, some sympathy, perhaps a missed psychological exam does not absolve him of accountability. This is not the Army's fault. This is about personal responsibility on Bergdahl's fault, and for him being held accountable for what he did. I will say, though, that there is a 4-star general, Robert Abrams, that is overseeing the court. He does have the final say. This is the same general who rejected pleas under the Obama administration that he not go to court-martial at all. So there is some hope, but, Martha, we've come from served with honor and distinction to this close to having justice after 8 years, and I just can't think of another word but devastating.
Right.